Like everyone around him in his home community of Hogeye, which is a town about 10 miles south of Fayetteville, Arkansas, Paul Ashton was brought up as a devout Christian, but something happened to him as a young man that provoked him to walk away from the religion of his childhood. Now, that something may have been a young woman named Caroline Pearl. Paul and Caroline grew up near each other, but they don't appear to have begun to spend any time together until the spring of 1927. Surviving letters between the two of them show an increasing attachment as the year progressed. Now, the pair even began toward the end of the year to refer to plans for the creation of a family together. It was clearly an intense romantic relationship. And now, a tragic series of events put an end to that attachment at the beginning of the next year. The records are incomplete, but Sophia Ashton believes that Caroline had become pregnant, and that the young lovers' families did not approve of the couple's plan to marry. Letters from Paul indicate it wasn't a merely economic unsuitability that led to the Ashton family's rejection of Caroline Pearl. Paul wrote that his affection for Caroline was not in spite of her darkness, but because of it. His repeated use of this phrase in his letters to different friends and members of the family indicate that the theme of Caroline's darkness was at the heart of his affection and his family's rejection of her. Now, the possibility that Paul might have been referring to a metaphorical darkness of temperament is contradicted by his defiant discussion of the racial politics within his own family. He wrote, "How can we reject Caroline when our own grandmother was a slave?" Now, surviving members of the Ashton family have vigorously denied the existence of any African ancestry within their family tree. However, they've also refused to share the results of any DNA analysis that could confirm their claims of what some Ashton family members refer to as their racial purity. Whatever the truth of the Ashton family lineage, Paul's belief in the hypocrisy of his family's racism led the young man into fundamental rejection of the conventional conservative values of his Ozarks community. By November 1928, he had enrolled as a member of the Communist Party, publicly advocating for revolution under his new name, Saul. Now, when Paul Ashton became Saul Ashton, it was a self-transformation intended as a mirror image of the transformation of the biblical Saul on the road to Damascus. In that classic story, Saul was a Jewish critic of Christianity who, as the legend has it, was traveling on the road to Damascus when he was confronted by the Spirit of Jesus, who demanded to know why Saul was persecuting him. Now, Saul didn't have a good response, apparently, and so he fell down to his knees in submission, changing his name to Paul to mark his spiritual transformation. Saul did the reverse. Saul Ashton did, going from Paul to Saul. So Saul Ashton did not join his family for its Thanksgiving or Christmas celebrations ever again after his separation from Caroline Pearl. Ashton's interest in the Ozark Howler came as a consequence of his rejection of Christianity, which he referred to as a, quote, deceptive and suppressive opiate. He observed the hostility of local churches to Ozark beliefs, folk beliefs, especially to beliefs about the Ozark Howler. Now, the pastor of the Billingsley Church in Hogeye touched on this Christian antipathy toward the Ozark Howler when he declared in a 1926 sermon that, quote, "The Black Howler is nothing more than a servant of the devil, a lesser demon spreading the message of its masters, tempting us into unholy Sabbaths with horned beasts in the darker valleys of our forested hills. Unquote. Well, Saul Ashton was intrigued by the tenacity with which this legendary rebel, the Ozark Howler, a rebel against spiritual norms, held on to its monstrous place in the imagination of his neighbors, despite the official church condemnation of it. He began his inquiries into the myths of the Ozark Howler through this lens of religious nonconformity, cataloging churchmen's diatribes against the beast, and a few of the stories included in his book, Tales of the Ozark Howler, touch upon that theme of Christian backlash against the Howler. Now, Saul regarded these attacks as a kind of redirection of Christianity's insecurities about its own moral failings, and he observed that preachers tended to focus their wrath upon members of their own congregations who were accused of insinuating a cult of the Ozark Howler, into church practices in the name of appealing to local traditions. Now, for Saul, it felt as if the Old Testament times had returned, with pastors afraid of the worship of the Ozark Howler as a new kind of golden bull. Now, there's no indication that Saul believed in the literal reality of the Ozark Howler. His repudiation of Christianity in favor of the secular ideology of communism would suggest that he rejected belief in all supernatural systems. On the other hand, there is no evidence that he disbelieved the stories about the Ozark Howler either. What is clear is that Saul recognized the usefulness of the Ozark Howler as an idea that he could use to counter prevailing cultural norms in his local community in the Ozarks, across the United States and the South as well. He said, quote, "A world in which the Ozark Howler could be roaming the night is a world in which we acknowledge that there is more to the world than the stories that were told in the Bible." Saul Ashton's use of the Ozark Howler as a medium for the expression of his resentment against Christianity and Southern culture more broadly provoked a great deal of resistance to the publication of his book. Church groups organized protests wherever Tales of the Ozark Howler was sold, and these protests continue in relatively muted form in the activism of a group called the Society to Obstruct Paganism. That's STOP. That's an evangelical group that seeks to censor the teaching of traditional characters in Southern folklore, including the Ozark Howler, but also including the Garow, the Snorfus, the Wampus Cat. They're worried about it being taught in public schools. This organization advocates a Christ-centered curriculum in the place of teaching about these traditional Ozark monsters. Well, after Saul Ashton's death in 1938, his own family cooperated with his Christian critics. They withdrew his book, Tales of the Ozark Howler, from publication. His wife Felicity and their children were disturbed by his communism, his atheism, and his opposition to racial discrimination. In order to rehabilitate the Ashton family's reputation, they not only blocked the sale of his book, but they also offered to pay libraries, bookstores, and individuals twice the original price for their copies of the book, which they then destroyed. The result was that within a decade, few copies of the book remained, and most people forgot that Tales of the Ozark Howler ever existed at all. Well, the stories that were gathered in that book were not forgotten, of course. What Ashton's critics miss most of all is that as much as Ashton hated the regressive, discriminatory aspects of Ozark culture, he also clearly adored the flavor of the life in the Ozarks. Tales of the Ozark Howler, it reads like a love letter to Ozark folklore. And so, although Saul Ashton's Howler is to be feared, it is also a beloved beast. The Missouri poet Rufus Gray takes a metaphorical approach to this Ozark Howler. In his book titled Ozark Howler Verse, Gray writes that, quote, "The Ozark Howler stands for a suspicion that the world holds much more than we commonly give it credit for."